Sokar is the name of the great god who triumphed over death. Is honored in one of the greatest necropolises of ancient Egypt, Saqqara, established by the first pharaohs of the first dynasty in the 31st century BCE. On its vast expanse of land, hundreds of thousands of tombs and monuments were built for people who, like Sokar, dreamed of conquering death. However, the ancient Egyptians didn't have a concept of death as we understand it. Life was eternal. It was simply divided into stages, and earthly life was just one of the brief but very significant phases in every person's journey. Likewise, tombs were not spaces for the dead. They were transitions between the world of the living and the eternally living. Looking at the desert surrounding Saqqara today, it's hard to imagine that during the construction of the first pyramids, this area wasn't sand, but a green savanna with lush fields, gardens and lakes. Initially, all the kings were buried in structures called mastabas, which resembled transected pyramids. At that time, human sacrifices were still practiced, so the smaller tombs surrounding the mastabas belonged to those who were obligated to follow the ruler into the afterlife to serve him there. However, the pharaohs quickly realized that this was a waste of human resources, and human sacrifices were replaced with Ushepti figurines, servants who would fulfill these roles in the afterlife. As for the mastabas of ordinary people, you won't find any scenes of death, funerary rites or gods within them. Instead, the deceased is depicted among family members in the familiar surroundings of their home, hunting, fishing, harvesting in the fields or performing craftwork. They are shown on boats or barges depending on what they did in life, because often they hoped to continue their favorite occupations and simply everyday tasks even after death. In the 27th century BCE, the first stone structure in human history appeared here, the Pyramid of Djoser. Initially, however, King Nechirichet was built just another mastaba for himself. But then, his architect, the priest and sage Imhotep, suggested placing a second mastaba on top of the first. The king liked this idea so much that they added a third, a fourth, a fifth and finally a sixth. This is how the world's first pyramid was created. A stone staircase for the pharaoh to ascend to the heavens and reunite with his ancestors and the gods. So why is it called the Pyramid of Djoser rather than the Pyramid of Nechirichet? After all, there are pyramids named after Khafra, Menkaura and so on. The reason is that as millennia passed, the names of the kings were forgotten. Nechirichet lived in the 27th century BCE, while Tutankhamun, for example, lived in the 14th century BCE, a span of about 1,300 years between them. However, the cult of the ancestors continued to be revered, and the king who built such a grand structure was regarded by subsequent pharaohs as their secret ancestor, which is what Djoser translates to, sacred ancestor. By the way, this is not just a stand-alone pyramid. It's a model of an entire city, the capital of the pharaoh, from which he would rule in the afterlife. The complex included its own temples, palaces, fields and even lakes. And at the center of it all, the pyramid played a crucial role. Originally, it was clad in perfectly polished white stones. But as you can imagine, the cladding has long since been stripped away, as have the stones from most of the temples. So we're lucky that anything remains at all. A long time ago, when I was looking at pictures of pyramids in a history textbook, I wondered, why is everyone so fascinated by the pyramids in Giza? I always thought it would be more interesting to see the very first pyramid in the world. And now here I am, looking at it. It's so astonishing. Beneath the pyramid lies more than 6 kilometers of corridors. There were rooms for funerary inventory, tombs for the pharaoh's family members, officials and courtiers, such as the pharaoh's sandal bearers, fan bearers, dentists and butchers. These individuals were interred later, when their time came, as they dreamed of being close to the pharaoh and becoming part of his entourage in the afterlife. At the center of the pyramid is a 10-meter deep shaft where Necherhet's sarcophagus stands. But unfortunately, despite the builders' best efforts, tomb robbers still managed to break into the pyramid, taking not only the treasures, but also the pharaoh's mummy. It's hard to say how they managed it, but in the end, only the king's feet were left behind in the tomb. On the northern side of the pyramid is the serdab, a sealed chamber where the statue of the king's ka was placed. Through specially made openings, the pharaoh could observe who came to his mortuary temple, bringing offerings, and how the priests performed the funerary rites. In some of the chambers, there are inscriptions made by hand with paint. These are the emotions of the first pilgrims from the times of Thutmose, Amenhotep and Ramessid dynasties, 14th, 13th, 12th century BCE. They came here, marveling at these ancient monuments of their glorious ancestor Djoser, created by the deified architect Imhotep, and recorded their awe directly on the walls. Ancient wonders in a way. It's important not to see the pyramids simply as structures. For the ancient Egyptians, the pyramid was a living being with a name of its own, and it was considered the king's final wife. The pyramid was also a property owner with fields, gardens, livestock and gold mines in Nubia. It was a significant economic entity, served by up to 350 priests. Until the 3rd millennium BCE, pyramids of different kings even exchanged goods, because before the Roman conquest there was no money in Egypt, only barter. The entire economy of the country was built on this system of trade. Sadly, many pyramids have not survived, and now they look like mere sand mounds. However, in ancient times they were no less grand than Djoser's pyramid. In the 25th century BCE, Pharaoh Unas also built a pyramid here, complete with temples and a massive processional road that stretched from a lake to the temples. While the inscriptions in the pyramids focused on the pharaoh's afterlife, the covered road featured reliefs depicting the real life of the entire country during the pharaoh's reign. Among these were even harrowing images of famine, showing the difficult times Egypt endured when the Nile's inundation was insufficient. In the 27th century BCE, the last king of the 3rd dynasty, Snefru, began constructing his pyramid not in Saqqara, but further south, in the necropolis of Merimda, now known as Meidum. However, the location wasn't on his own choosing. This pyramid was inherited from his father-in-law in an unfinished state, and Snefru set out to complete it for himself. Initially, Snefru planned to make it an enormous 8-stepped pyramid, the tallest in the world. But then he decided to undertake an even more innovative project. He aimed to transform it into a perfectly smooth side pyramid, laying down all the steps and adding a smooth casing without any protrusions. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. After the pyramid had already been consecrated and given a name, it suddenly began to collapse. The eternal supports couldn't bear the weight, and the structure caved in on the burial chamber, while the outer casing crumbled away. In this state, the pyramid became unsuitable for the king's burial. However, services in the temple adjacent to the now divine pyramid continued to be held for many centuries, honoring the living pyramid despite its ruin. But this disaster was not only a catastrophe for the king, but also for the nobles who were built their magnificent necropolis next to their ruler's pyramid. While Snefru could afford to move the construction of his new burial place to another site, Dahshur, after one failure, the nobles didn't have that luxury. In Dahshur, 2 more pyramids were built for King Snefru. One of them, the so-called Bent Pyramid, earned its name due to unusual bent halfway up. Initially, the intention was to build it even taller, but as construction progressed, it became clear that if the pyramid were completed at such a steep angle, it might also collapse under its own weight. Therefore, midway through the construction, the decision was made to change the angle of the slope. However, despite all the efforts, even this pyramid did not become the king's final resting place. What's most remarkable is that the casing of this pyramid has been preserved better than any other. It's in such good condition that you can see just how perfectly it was polished. So much so that, as they say, you couldn't even slide the credit card into the joints. In fact, there were no gaps. If a stone was uneven or chipped, it was smoothed or patched. And finally, the third pyramid, which was nicknamed the Red Pyramid or Pink Pyramid, because it was built from slightly reddish stone. However, in ancient times, its casing was white, just like the other pyramids. Here, all previous mistakes was taken into account, and the builders finally managed to achieve the perfect angle, so that nothing would slide or collapse. This pyramid is the deepest, descending 62 meters underground, and architecturally it's the most refined. And now here is something incredible. After Snefru finally obtained his perfect pyramid, with all the accumulated knowledge and experience, he sent his builders and architects back to Meidum to redo his very first pyramid, aiming to make it just as beautiful. However, in the end, none of them were ever fully completed, and the king's burial place has never been found. Researchers tend to believe that he was likely buried in the Red Pyramid, because it is the most finely finished on the inside and more complete than the others. Yet, no visible evidence of a sarcophagus has been discovered. Despite this, Snefru was a highly successful and revered king. Priests continued to perform rituals in his mortuary temples until the 4th century BCE, at least 2000 years after his death. I would love for 350 priests to perform rituals for me for another 2000 years after my passing.